She had always imagined moving into a neighborhood where life would feel calm and simple. The streets were quiet, lined with trees that swayed gently in the wind, and the houses were neat, each with a small garden that reflected the care of the people living inside. When she first walked through the area, she felt a sense of hope and relief. Finally, a place where she could feel at home. She had saved for years, worked long hours, and made sacrifices to buy this house. And now she felt a lightness she hadn't felt in a long time. At first, the neighborhood seemed welcoming. People smiled politely when she passed, waved from their porches, and said hello. There was a small water feature near her house, a tiny dam that controlled the flow of water into the little canal that ran behind the properties. It gave a soft sound of running water, and she often stood by it in the evenings, letting her thoughts drift. Everything felt peaceful, and she thought this would be her sanctuary. She didn't know much about the Homeowners Association, or HOA, when she bought the house. They had given her some pamphlets, signed papers, and explained the basic rules, but she hadn't paid much attention. After all, she thought, rules are rules, and she planned to follow them. She didn't imagine that a small organization would hold so much power over her daily life. The first warning came quietly. She had painted her front door a shade of blue, slightly different from the official guide. She thought it was subtle, pretty, and inoffensive. A few days later, she received a letter. The language was polite on the surface, but firm, saying that she needed to repaint the door or face a fine. She felt a flicker of frustration. It seemed extreme, but she reminded herself that she had agreed to the rules. She brushed it off, thinking, okay, I will fix this. No problem. But then the next incident happened. She placed a small garden gnome in her yard, just a simple figure that added charm to her garden. Again, she received a warning. This time, it mentioned that her gnome violated the HOA's aesthetic guidelines. She couldn't believe it. She had moved here to have peace, and now it felt like even a tiny decoration was being scrutinized. She began keeping a folder with all the notices, thinking it was probably nothing serious yet, just a strict community, nothing personal. As weeks passed, the letters became more frequent. Sometimes, it was about the grass being slightly longer than the HOA preferred. Sometimes, it was about leaves from her trees that had fallen into the neighbor's yard. It felt like she was constantly walking on eggshells. Every time she did something small and harmless, there was a letter waiting in the mailbox. She started feeling anxious. She had bought a home to enjoy her life, not to worry about every little detail. She tried to attend the HOA meetings, hoping to understand the rules better and to explain herself. The meetings, however, were often closed off to residents, or the topics she brought up were ignored. The leadership seemed to make decisions without discussion, and her questions were brushed aside. The more she tried to engage, the more she felt invisible. It was confusing and frustrating. She began to notice a subtle tension from some neighbors too, as if siding with the HOA was expected around this time. She started paying more attention to the water feature near her house. At first, it had seemed like a peaceful addition, but she began noticing something troubling. Whenever there was heavy rain, the dam's structure caused the water to overflow onto her yard. Puddles formed, the grass grew muddy, and some areas began to erode. She mentioned it politely to the HOA in writing, hoping they would take action. But they replied that the structure was standard, safe, and part of the community rules. She could sense that they weren't interested in listening. Their letters always emphasized that she needed to maintain her property according to the rules. Without acknowledging that their dam was causing problems, the frustration began to build, but she tried to stay calm. She researched what her neighbors had done in similar situations, hoping to find guidance. Some residents had tried to fight the HOA's decisions before, but most ended up giving in. The HOA had a reputation for being firm, unyielding, and at times, unfair. The stories she found online told of people being fined for small things, harassed over minor disagreements, or having their complaints ignored. She began to realize that she wasn't alone, but it still felt isolating. She had moved to a neighborhood expecting a sense of community, and now she was feeling trapped. Despite the growing tension, she tried to maintain her routines. She watered her garden carefully, kept her yard clean, and avoided anything that might draw attention. She attended neighborhood events, smiled at neighbors, and tried to show that she was friendly and cooperative. But the letters kept coming. Every time it rained, her yard flooded. Every time she tried to improve her garden, there was some new complaint. The pressure was becoming relentless. One evening, after a particularly heavy rain, she stood near the water feature again. Water was pooling in her yard, seeping toward her basement. She looked at the dam, small but imposing, and felt a mix of anger and helplessness. It had started as a simple part of the neighborhood, but now it was a symbol of control. Something that the HOA used to remind her that she wasn't truly free in her own home. She knew she had to find a solution, but she wasn't sure how. She felt the weight of being singled out, of rules being applied selectively, and of her voice being ignored. The next day, she began to take notes. She photographed the water levels, documented the damage to her property, and saved copies of every letter the HOA had sent her. She started reading the community's governing documents carefully, trying to understand exactly what the HOA could legally enforce. She discovered that there were vague clauses in the rules, giving the HOA wide discretion over decisions, but she also noticed areas where the HOA might have overstepped. It was a small ray of hope, a sense that maybe, just maybe, there was a way to push back without breaking the law. She began to talk quietly with neighbors, careful not to cause conflict but curious to know if anyone else had similar experiences. A few admitted that they had been intimidated by the HOA in the past, but many stayed silent. The fear of fines, of confrontation, and of social tension was real. She realized that the HOA had created a culture of control where even small acts of defiance felt risky. Yet the more she learned, the more determined she became. She didn't want to be afraid in her own home. She didn't want the neighborhood to feel like a place of rules over people in the evenings. She spent time by the water, watching the current flow and listening to the soft rush. It reminded her of freedom, of the way nature finds its path despite obstacles. She began to imagine what it would be like if the dam weren't there. The water could flow naturally and her property remained safe. She didn't have all the answers yet, but the idea took root. It was a spark, a sense that control could be challenged with patience, knowledge, and careful action. She also began to reflect on why she had moved in the first place. She wanted a home where she could breathe, a place where her life could feel hers. She realized that the HOA's control wasn't just about fines or rules. It was about taking away that sense of ownership, of agency. That realization strengthened her resolve. She knew she would have to be strategic, persistent, smart if she wanted to regain control. By the end of the first month, she felt both exhausted and alive. The situation was stressful, but it also awakened a sense of purpose. She was no longer just a resident quietly following rules. She was someone who needed to understand, document, and prepare. The dam, the letters, and the unyielding HOA became a challenge she couldn't ignore. She knew that the path ahead would require courage, but she was beginning to see that there might be a way to live freely again in her own home. And so, she stood by the water that night, watching the small dam, feeling the cool breeze, and thinking about what could be done. She didn't have a plan yet, but she had a vision, a place where rules didn't control her life, where her property could thrive, and where the community could be fair and just. The journey had begun, and she was ready. Even if she didn't know exactly where it would lead, she thought the first month had been difficult. But the next weeks proved even harder. The HOA seemed to notice that she was paying attention, documenting everything, and quietly questioning their authority. Soon their letters became sharper in tone. They criticized her landscaping choices, the small, decorative items she placed near her walkway, and even the type of mulch she used in her garden. Every note carried an unspoken warning, as if to say she was being watched, and any misstep could cost her. She felt the tension in the neighborhood growing as well. Some neighbors began to treat her differently, nodding politely but avoiding real conversation. A few whispered behind her back. She realized that the HOA's influence wasn't only about rules, it was about creating a culture of fear, making people doubt themselves and each other. She hated this feeling, but she refused to let it break her spirit. She reminded herself why she had moved here, and she kept recording everything meticulously. Her phone and notebook became constant companions. The water feature continued to cause problems. After a particularly heavy rainfall, water once again spilled over, soaking parts of her garden and reaching near the foundation of her home. She called the HOA office, politely explaining the issue and requesting a stance. The reply was curt. The structure was in compliance with all community guidelines, and it was her responsibility to manage any flooding on her property. She felt a mix of disbelief and anger. How could something they built be her responsibility when it caused the damage? It didn't make sense, yet she was left to figure it out on her own. She decided to take matters into her own hands, researching ways to control the water flow without breaking any rules. She read guides about drainage systems, landscaping solutions, and environmental regulations. She spent hours online, making careful notes and sketches of possible improvements. Every solution needed to be legal, safe, and within the boundaries set by the HOA. It was exhausting work, but it gave her a sense of control she hadn't felt in weeks. Meanwhile, the HOA meetings continued to frustrate her. When she attempted to attend, she found that the discussions were dominated by a few powerful members who rarely addressed her questions. She tried to speak up, but often she was talked over or her concerns were quickly dismissed. They emphasized community standards and rules, giving long speeches about responsibility, order, and aesthetics, yet ignored the practical issues she raised about safety and property damage. She realized the HOA wasn't interested in fairness, they were interested in power, feeling isolated. She began seeking advice from outside the community. She reached out to local city officials, read community guidelines, and even spoke with environmental inspectors about the water feature. Each conversation gave her more clarity about her rights and the limits of the HOA's power. Slowly, a picture began to form. The dam structure, while small, was not fully authorized by the city, and it was causing real problems for the properties nearby. This knowledge made her feel a cautious sense of hope. At the same time, the stress began to take a toll on her daily life. She noticed herself getting restless, losing sleep, and feeling anxious about simple activities. Every time it rained, she worried about flooding. Every time the mailbox arrived, she dreaded what new letter awaited. Yet, despite the anxiety, she also felt determination growing stronger. She refused to be bullied in her own home. She was willing to fight for what was right, even if the path was unclear. One morning, she woke early to check the water after a night of heavy rain. She stepped outside, boots sinking slightly into the wet ground, and saw puddles spreading across her yard. She examined the dam and noticed small cracks forming along its edge. The water was finding new paths, flowing unpredictably. She took photos from multiple angles, documenting every detail. Each photo became evidence, a record of what the HOA's structure was doing to her property. She also started speaking discreetly with other neighbors. Some had quietly experienced similar issues, but none had spoken up. The fear of retaliation was strong, yet she felt a sense of solidarity forming, even if unspoken. She wasn't alone, and this realization gave her courage. She continued gathering information, building a careful case. In planning her next steps at night, she would sit by the small water feature, listening to the soft rush of water and thinking about what she could do. She imagined a solution where the water flowed naturally, her garden remained safe, and the HOA couldn't use it as a tool for control. The idea wasn't fully formed yet, but she could feel it taking shape. It was a quiet vision of freedom, a hope that she could regain peace without confrontation. Meanwhile, the HOA seemed to sense her growing confidence. Letters became more frequent and detailed, scrutinizing every aspect of her property. They sent inspectors who walked through her yard, taking notes on minor issues. She remained calm, documenting each visit carefully. Every interaction became part of her growing understanding of how the HOA operated. They were not simply enforcing rules, they were testing her, trying to see how far they could push her. The pressure was intense, but she also began noticing small victories. When she politely questioned an unfair fine, one of the board members took longer than usual to respond, clearly considering her points. She realized that by documenting, researching, and staying calm, she could challenge their authority effectively. She began to feel that the situation was less about fear and more about strategy, patience, and persistence. One afternoon, she decided to visit the city planning office to inquire about the water structure. She brought her photos, notes, and copies of the HOA letters. The city official listened carefully and examined her evidence. They explained that the structure was questionable and that the HOA had limited authority over certain modifications. They encouraged her to continue documenting and assured her that she had the right to request inspections and report safety concerns. She left feeling empowered, knowing she wasn't powerless after all. She also took time to reflect on her emotional state. The stress, fear, and frustration had been heavy, but she realized that the situation was teaching her resilience. She was learning how to stand up for herself calmly and effectively, how to gather facts, and how to navigate difficult authority structures. It was exhausting, yes, but also instructive. She could feel herself growing stronger, more focused, and more determined. In the evenings, she continued spending time by the water thinking about the next steps. She made sketches, wrote down observations, and imagined how a fair and functional water flow could change everything. She pictured her yard safe from flooding, her garden thriving, and her neighbors seeing that the HOA could be held accountable. It was a vision that motivated her, a quiet fire that kept her moving forward. By the end of the second part of her journey, she understood the full scope of the challenge. The HOA was not simply a group enforcing rules. It was a structure of control that affected her daily life in subtle and powerful ways. Yet she had knowledge, evidence, and growing courage. She wasn't alone, even if others were silent. The dam and the letters were no longer just problems. They were opportunities to challenge unfairness and reclaim her home. The pressure was building, but so was her determination. She knew that the next steps would require careful planning, patience, and courage, and she was ready to face them. Over the next few weeks, she focused on learning everything she could about the water feature and the HOA's authority. She spent long evenings at her kitchen table sifting through property records, city permits, and environmental guidelines. Each document gave her more insight into the situation. The more she discovered, the clearer it became that the HOA had built and maintained the dam without proper authorization. While they acted as though it was part of the community's safety measures, in reality, it had no legal backing. And it was causing tangible problems for her and potentially for other residents. She began creating a timeline of events. She documented each rainstorm, each flood, each letter she received, and each minor inspection the HOA conducted. She also noted which rules they enforced selectively and which ones they ignored for certain residents. Patterns began to emerge. The HOA wasn't just strict. They were using the water feature and their rules as tools of control. It was subtle, but powerful, and she realized that she had to be strategic in her approach. Acting impulsively would not help her. She needed a clear plan. One day, she decided to speak privately with a neighbor who had lived in the community for many years. He was cautious, but willing to talk. He confirmed some of her suspicions. The HOA often acted beyond its legal authority, and many residents were too afraid to speak up. They feared fines, lawsuits, or social isolation. He encouraged her to keep documenting and suggested reaching out to city officials to clarify what the HOA could and could not do. She thanked him quietly, realizing she now had a subtle network of support. It wasn't much, but it was a start. She also began noticing other residents experiencing similar issues with the water feature. Some had flooding in their yards, others had erosion near foundations, and a few had minor property damage. Most didn't complain, either out of fear or resignation. She felt a growing sense of responsibility. This wasn't just about her home. It was about the integrity of the neighborhood and the well-being of other residents. Her goal became clearer. She wanted to address the problem responsibly, legally, and visibly enough that the HOA could no longer ignore it. With renewed focus, she contacted the city's building and environmental departments. She provided her documentation, explained the flooding issues, and inquired about the legitimacy of the dam. The officials listened attentively, asking questions about the history of the structure and the impact on nearby properties. They promised to investigate and indicated that, if the dam was unauthorized or unsafe, corrective measures could be taken. She left the office feeling a mix of relief and anticipation. Finally, she wasn't fighting alone. Authorities who could make a difference were involved. The stress didn't completely fade, however. The HOA continued sending letters, sometimes questioning things she had no control over. It's like how she trimmed the hedges or the color of seasonal decorations. It was clear they were trying to intimidate her, to make her feel powerless. Yet each letter only strengthened her resolve. She refused to respond with anger or aggression, knowing that calm persistence would serve her better. Instead, she carefully archived each communication. Photographing and scanning them for records, she also began thinking about how to involve the community. She wanted to inform neighbors without creating conflict or fear. She wrote letters explaining the situation, sharing factual details about the dam, and gently encouraging them to observe any flooding or property damage. She wanted residents to understand that the issue is about safety and legality, not personal grievances. Slowly, a few people reached out to her, confirming that they had noticed similar problems but had been hesitant to speak up. This quiet solidarity bolstered her confidence. Meanwhile, she continued observing the dam itself. She noticed small cracks widening, water finding new paths, and erosion near the edges. She photographed these changes daily, compiling a visual record that clearly showed the structure's instability. She realized that time was critical. If the dam failed during heavy rain, the consequences could be serious. The urgency of the situation strengthened her. Determination to see things through, carefully but decisively. She spent evenings thinking about possible solutions. She sketched ideas for safely redirecting water, ways to reinforce her yard, and methods to bring the situation to city officials effectively. Each plan was legal, measured, and responsible. She was determined to act not out of anger, but out of the need to protect her home and restore balance to the neighborhood. In her mind, the dam represented not just a physical obstacle, but a symbol of the HOA's overreach and the fear they instilled in residents. Her research also revealed historical mistakes in the HOA's formation and bylaws. Certain clauses they relied on to enforce fines were vague or inconsistent with state law. This legal knowledge gave her hope that she could challenge unfair enforcement. She consulted a lawyer briefly, confirmed that the HOA had limited power in some areas, and that property owners had the right to request inspections and corrective actions. The conversation gave her clarity. She could act confidently, armed with facts and evidence. One day, a small group of neighbors joined her in observing the water after a heavy storm. They measured the flow, noted areas of flooding, and shared stories of past damage. It was a quiet, careful collaboration, but it created a sense of community around a shared concern. They weren't rebelling against the HOA. They were documenting real problems, gathering evidence, and taking responsible steps. This cautious collective action gave her a sense of purpose and connection she had not felt in weeks. Despite her progress, the HOA was powerful in its own way, and she knew that any public confrontation could trigger retaliation. She focused on facts, observations, and legal channels. She didn't vent on social media or engage in arguments. Her approach was deliberate: show evidence, follow regulations, and let authorities handle enforcement. She believed that truth, documented carefully, was her strongest tool. Her evenings remained focused on observation. She would walk near the dam, watching how the water flowed, noting how it interacted with the landscape, and imagining ways to restore a natural balance. Each small crack, each diverted stream, each erosion mark became part of her growing knowledge. The dam was no longer just a passive structure. It was central to understanding the neighborhood's challenges and the HOA's overreach. By the end of this phase, she had built a clear case. She knew what the HOA had done, what legal limits they had over the property, and what steps could be taken to address the water problem responsibly. She also realized that this wasn't just a personal fight. It was about the safety and fairness of the entire community. The small dam had become a symbol of both challenge and opportunity, a test of patience, resilience, and careful planning. she began to feel a quiet excitement. She could see the possibility of restoring balance, not just in her yard, but in the neighborhood. The legal path, the documentation, and the support of authorities and neighbors created a roadmap for action. She knew that the next steps would require careful execution, but she also knew that the momentum was building. She was no longer passive or intimidated. She was learning how to face control with intelligence, courage, and precision. As the nights grew cooler, she continued to sit by the water feature. Listening to the sound of flowing water and imagining the future, she pictured a community where residents felt safe, where property was respected, and where fairness guided decisions rather than fear. The dam, once a source of frustration, had become a focal point of understanding, strategy, and quiet determination. She realized that she was ready for what would come next. The stage was set for action, and she felt prepared, grounded, and determined to see the situation through too. Resolution. The day finally came when she decided to take the next steps officially. Armed with months of documentation, photographs, notes from neighbors, and information from city officials, she submitted a formal request to have the dam inspected. She detailed the flooding, the erosion, and the potential hazards the structure posed to properties nearby. She emphasized that her goal was not to create conflict, but to ensure the community's safety and fairness. She sent the request both to the city authorities and copied the HOA, making it clear that her concern was legal, factual, and serious. For several days, there was no response. She felt the familiar tension building, but this time it was mixed with anticipation. She had done everything responsibly, and now it was in the hands of those with authority. The city inspectors eventually scheduled a visit. When they arrived, she led them around the property, pointing out the areas where water had overflowed, showing cracks in the dam, and explaining the repeated impact of the structure on her yard and nearby properties. She spoke calmly, methodically, and with clarity. It was a far cry from the anxiety she had felt when the first letter from the HOA arrived months ago. The inspection took several hours. The officials measured water levels, examined the dam's construction, and reviewed property boundaries. They took photos, recorded observations, and asked questions about prior issues and correspondence with the HOA. She provided copies of all her records, showing the sequence of damage, letters, and communications. By the end of the day, she felt a sense of accomplishment. She had faced the situation head-on, without confrontation. She had the evidence to support her position. A few days later, she received the results. The city officials determined that the dam was indeed unauthorized and had been improperly maintained. They noted that it posed risks to surrounding properties and that corrective measures were required. The HOA could no longer enforce fines or threaten residents regarding the structure. They were instructed to remove or properly modify the dam to meet safety and legal standards. The news felt like a wave of relief, but she also understood that the real challenge would be ensuring that the order was followed and that the HOA accepted the decision. The following weeks were tense. The HOA initially resisted, claiming the city's decision was overly cautious and that the structure was part of the neighborhood's tradition. She remained patient, providing further evidence when necessary and maintaining calm communication. Neighbors, emboldened by the official findings, began quietly sharing their experiences. The HOA, realizing that legal authorities were involved and that residents were now informed, could no longer ignore the situation. Slowly, they began to comply with the order. She also began taking practical steps to protect her property during the transition. She improved drainage in her yard, placed temporary barriers, and coordinated with neighbors to ensure that water flow would not create additional problems. Each small action was a reminder that she had regained a sense of control. She was no longer at the mercy of the HOA's arbitrary rules. She was actively shaping the outcome. The removal process itself was methodical. Contractors arrived to dismantle the dam safely, redirecting water into natural channels and ensuring minimal disruption to the surrounding areas. She watched carefully, noting each step and photographing progress. The sound of flowing water changed, becoming more natural and free. It was as if the neighborhood itself was breathing again, released from the control the structure had symbolized. During this period, she also engaged with neighbors more openly. People approached her to thank her for her diligence and courage. Some admitted they had felt afraid to challenge the HOA before, but were inspired by her approach. It was a quiet sense of community rebuilding, shared understanding that fairness and safety could prevail when approached responsibly. She felt proud, not of confrontation, but of the ability to bring knowledge, patience, perseverance together to create change. Even after the dam was removed, she continued to monitor the area. Rainy days were now different. Water flowed naturally, gardens remained safe, and the risk of flooding was reduced. The HOA could no longer leverage the structure to intimidate residents. Letters about minor rule violations still arrived occasionally, but they no longer carried the weight of fear. Her careful documentation, calm approach, and adherence to legal channels had shifted the balance of power. She reflected on the lessons she had learned. The situation had been exhausting, stressful, and at times lonely. But it had also taught her resilience, patience, and strategic thinking. She realized that standing up to unfair control didn't require anger or rebellion. It required knowledge, preparation, and the courage to follow through responsibly. The small dam, once a source of frustration, had become a teacher, showing her how to navigate challenges with clarity and calm. The neighborhood itself began to change subtly. Conversations were more open, residents were more willing to discuss concerns, and there was a renewed focus on fairness and safety. The HOA, while still present, operated with less arbitrary power. Residents no longer felt the same fear or pressure. The community was healthier, more aware, and more balanced. And she had played a central role in that transformation. Sitting by the now free-flowing water, she felt a sense of peace she had not known since moving in. The water moved naturally, her property was safe, and the neighborhood felt alive again. The struggle had been long, but the outcome was worth every effort. She understood that change often required patience, persistence, and careful action, and she was proud to have navigated the challenge without compromising her values. As the weeks passed, she continued to maintain her property, engage positively with neighbors, and watch the neighborhood flourish. The dam was gone, but the lessons it had taught her remained. She felt stronger, more confident, and more connected to her home and community. What had begun as a struggle against control had become a journey of empowerment, learning, and quiet triumph. The experience also gave her a broader perspective on life. Challenges often came disguised as obstacles, and power could manifest in subtle ways. But with knowledge, careful planning, and persistence, even the most controlling structures could be addressed. She realized that true strength wasn't about confrontation. It was about understanding, strategy, and patience. The small dam had tested her, but it had also shown her how to reclaim her life and her home. She was ready for the next chapter, confident that she could face whatever challenges lay ahead. After the dam was removed and the water flowed naturally again, life in the neighborhood began to settle into a new rhythm. She had spent months navigating stress, intimidation, and the constant pressure from the HOA, but now there was a sense of relief. Her yard was safe, her property intact, and the constant fear of arbitrary fines had lifted. She took deep breaths as she walked through her garden, feeling a sense of ownership and peace she had not felt since moving in. Neighbors began to approach her more openly. Some expressed gratitude for her persistence, quietly sharing that they had been too intimidated to speak up themselves. They admitted they had watched from afar, hoping someone would take action, and her careful, calm approach had inspired them. The neighborhood dynamic began to shift. People were more willing to share concerns, collaborate on solutions, and engage with the HOA in a constructive manner. Fear was gradually replaced by cautious confidence. The HOA leadership, while still present, no longer held the same unchecked influence. They had complied with the city's directives, and residents now had a clearer understanding of their rights. The arbitrary power that once dictated minor details of everyone's lives had diminished. She could see the subtle changes: fewer letters enforcing trivial fines, more respectful dialogue, and a sense that the rules were being applied fairly. The community had learned that persistence and evidence could challenge control without creating conflict. Her own life improved dramatically. She could enjoy her mornings in the garden without worrying about flooding or fines. Planting flowers, arranging her landscaping, and taking care of her home. The sound of flowing water from the former dam's path was soothing, a reminder of the struggle and the calm that followed. The environment she had dreamed of was finally taking shape. She could focus on living rather than constantly defending herself. The months of tension had left lessons etched in her mind. She had learned patience, the importance of careful documentation, and the power of strategic action. She realized that standing up to control didn't require aggression. It required understanding, preparation, and courage. The experience had strengthened her confidence in her own judgment and in her ability to navigate difficult situations. She knew that challenges would arise in the future, but she felt equipped to handle them thoughtfully and responsibly. She also observed the water feature and surrounding area with a sense of satisfaction. Where once there had been flooding, erosion, and uncertainty, there was now balance. Water moved naturally through the landscape, nourishing plants without threatening property. She felt a quiet joy in seeing the land flourish and in knowing that her careful efforts had contributed to a positive change for everyone in the community. The neighbors, too, seemed more connected. Casual conversations about gardening, local events, and community concerns felt genuine rather than cautious. There was a newfound openness, a shared understanding that fairness and respect were possible. The small actions she had taken had ripple effects beyond her own property. Encouraging others to engage thoughtfully with challenges rather than fear them, she took time to reflect on her journey. The struggle with the HOA had been intense, exhausting, and at times isolating, but it had also been transformative. She had discovered her own resilience and learned how to confront difficulties with intelligence and patience. The situation had shown her that control could be challenged, fairness could be restored, and communities could heal when individuals acted responsibly and courageously. One afternoon, she decided to host a small gathering in her backyard. It was informal, just a chance to enjoy the garden and share the sense of relief and accomplishment with neighbors who had quietly supported her or simply observed. People shared stories, laughed, and marveled at the improved state of the water feature in gardens. It was a moment of community bonding, a tangible reminder of what could be achieved when fear was replaced with informed action and cooperation. The HOA, now aware that residents were more informed and empowered, began to act more transparently. Meetings included clear agendas, and residents were encouraged to ask questions. Decisions were communicated openly, and there was a noticeable effort to engage constructively rather than control. The neighborhood had not only regained its physical balance, but also its social balance, and she had played a central role in that transformation. She continued to monitor her property and the surrounding area, but the vigilance was no longer stressful. It was empowering. Each rainfall, each breeze, each season brought reminders of the careful attention she had given to her home and her community. She knew that responsibility came with ownership, and that careful observation could prevent small problems from becoming crises. The balance she had fought for was sustainable because it had been built on knowledge, effort, and collaboration. Looking back, she understood that the dam had been more than just a physical obstacle. It was a symbol of control, fear, and arbitrary power, but it had also been a catalyst for growth. The struggle had revealed strengths she didn't know she had, encouraged connections with neighbors, and demonstrated the importance of patience and perseverance. The resolution had brought freedom, safety, and peace of mind, and the lessons would stay with her for a lifetime. Her mornings now began with quiet walks through her yard. Listening to the gentle flow of water and the sounds of birds and rustling leaves, she took pride in the harmony she had helped restore, appreciating the resilience of both the land and the community. Life had regained a sense of simplicity and beauty, and she felt a deep gratitude for the journey, despite its challenges. The experience also gave her perspective on future challenges. She knew that life could present obstacles, but she had learned how to approach them calmly, strategically, and with persistence. She realized that true empowerment came not from aggression or conflict, but from preparation, knowledge, and steady determination. The HOA had been a trial, but she had emerged stronger, wiser, more confident in her ability to navigate control and influence with clarity and composure. As the sun set over the neighborhood, casting warm light over gardens, streets, and homes, she felt a sense of completion. The struggle with the HOA and the dam had tested her, but it had also revealed the possibilities of resilience and responsible action. The water flowed freely, her home was secure, and her community was beginning to thrive in a fairer, more balanced way. She understood that change was possible, even against seemingly entrenched control, and that careful, persistent effort could create lasting impact.